Fernando Alonso has completed his first full test in Renault's 2020 car ahead of his Formula 1 comeback next year, in a controversial outing that shows the two-time world champion hasn't lost any of his ability to get under the skin of his opposition. Alonso enjoyed a day in the RS20 in Abu Dhabi 2 days after the season finale, after being given permission to join a test initially reserved for those who haven't started more than 2 Grand Prix. For the avoidance of doubt, the rulemakers haven't forgotten that 39-year-old Alonso is the third most experienced driver in F1 history. A few other familiar faces were eventually given dispensation to take part as well, but unlike the other former F1 drivers taking part, Alonso's actually going to be racing in F1 next year. That's got a few of his 2021 rivals a bit hot and bothered, namely the ones who are changing teams and feel Alonso's been afforded an unfair advantage. I'm Scott Mitchell for The Race, and thank you very much for watching this video, which is going to explore exactly why Alonso's test has angered some of his rivals. While it's easy and, let's face it, a bit of fun to joke about a driver of Alonso's level of experience and his age taking part in a young driver test, this exception is unfair and it sends a bad message about the championship's rulemaking process. If the test was a free-for-all, Ferrari, McLaren, Renault and Racing Point would almost certainly have held the relevant discussions required to let the 2021 driver moves play out a little earlier. We're not saying everyone would have been released from their contracts, but it could potentially have ended with the Abu Dhabi test featuring Carlos Sainz Jr. driving in a Ferrari, Sebastian Vettel being in a Racing Point, and Daniel Ricciardo appearing in a McLaren. But it wasn't a free-for-all, it was never meant to be a free-for-all, so these conversations never took place. It was agreed months ago, back in April, that this test would be cut to just 1 day and be solely for the purpose of young drivers to save costs and potentially give smaller teams the commercial benefit of selling the seats. Restrictions were also put in place to stop teams turning it into a day of massive research and development work by forcing teams to run their cars in the same specification as they did in a Grand Prix this season. So Ferrari, McLaren and Racing Point all made different arrangements. Ferrari committed to running 2 drivers who fit the criteria for the test, while McLaren and Racing Point decided it wasn't worthwhile taking part at all. So it's now no surprise that all 3 teams are aggrieved that Renault got given permission to run its new 2021 driver after all, and has been handed a free opportunity to get Alonso up to speed more quickly ahead of the shortened 3-day preseason test next year. That seems pretty poor reward for agreeing to the rule change regarding the test in the first place, and it's not exactly a convincing reason to trust the process either. Alonso's test has been played down by some as being of pretty limited value, but if that was the case, he wouldn't be driving. So far, the on-track work for his 2021 comeback has been limited to 100 kilometers of running in a filming day completed earlier in the summer, and lots of mileage in Renault's 2018 car, all of which using special Pirelli tyres that aren't the same as what the teams race with. Getting to drive the 2020 car in a proper test is therefore huge for Alonso's familiarisation with Renault's most recent challenger, one that will form the basis of its 2021 design as well, given the amount of parts carryover. In effect, Renault and Alonso's 2021 testing allowance of 1.5 days has been nearly doubled. Renault framed the decision to let Alonso take part in the test as one made in recognition of the team's history with young drivers and the double world champion's own efforts in that regard. Team boss Cyril Abiteboul launched a fierce defence of Alonso's test by going on the offensive. He said no other manufacturer has invested half of what Renault has in young drivers, so asking to use one of its cars for Alonso was not an unreasonable request. Abiteboul claimed aggrieved rivals simply need to deal with it, then rounded on Racing Point in particular by declaring it would be quite ironic for that team to challenge the FIA following the controversy earlier this year surrounding Racing Point's 2020 car. If you're not up to speed with the pink Mercedes saga, you can check out our other videos on the subject, but for now you just need to remember that Racing Point was allowed to continue using its RP20 all season, despite its rear brake ducts being found to be illegally designed, although the points penalty the team copped for that did ultimately cost them 3rd in the championship. But Abiteboul said of Racing Point boss Otmar Szafnauer, if he wants to build a claim against the FIA, that would be quite rich, keeping in mind that we all know they have an illegal car. In Renault's defence, while some may be frustrated that it sought to get out of a unanimous agreement to only run young drivers, in a competitive world like F1 it shouldn't really feel guilty about this request, given its situation has changed since April and the fact it's bankrolled the Euro Cup Championship for decades and helped plenty of young drivers along the way means it does have a legitimate case to make. Back when Renault agreed for this test to just be for young drivers, Alonso's comeback was far from guaranteed, and the shortened 2021 pre-season test means every bit of mileage counts. Making this change was in its best interests, so it might as well ask. However, the logic Renault espoused doesn't go for Red Bull running Sebastian Buemi in the test, or Alfa Romeo running one-time race winner Robert Kubica, or ex-McLaren driver Stoffel Vandoorne driving for Mercedes. They're driving because an exception was made to allow drivers who haven't raced in F1 in the past 2 seasons participate in this test. In fact, that exception was the only official explanation offered by the FIA for any of the ineligible drivers, including Alonso, being allowed to take part. That doesn't help the perception that this was simply a move to let Renault and Alonso get what they want, then needing to let a few others there as well, just to avoid it being a singular exception. The ultimate responsibility lies with the rule makers, with the lack of clear logic behind why some exceptions were made and not others, and the unfair situation this has created. There are 3 main ways to justify Alonso doing this test. First, that Renault and Alonso should get a helping hand because he's been out of racing for 2 years and his comeback is good for F1. Second, that it's good value for F1 for Alonso to be in the 2020 Renault as soon as possible, creating an interesting end-of-year story. Third, that it's a fair trade for the effort Renault's put into helping young drivers over past decades and the fact that Alonso's involved with his own junior team. But if we take these apart one by one, we see the holes in the arguments. On the first point, it's Alonso's fault that he's been absent from Formula 1. Renault knew that limitation and the risk when it signed him, and it did have the option of running Alonso in some Friday practice sessions this year to aid his familiarisation, but it didn't do that because it didn't suit Renault's agenda. Now the rule makers are giving them a leg up, which isn't fair. Yes, Mick Schumacher and Yuki Tsunoda both took part in the test as well, so that's a vital head start on their pre-season preparations, but the difference between 2 rookies and a 2-time world champion who's been out of F1 by choice should be pretty obvious. On the second point, if F1 really cared about the news value of someone testing a 2020 car in Abu Dhabi a week before Christmas, surely it would do everything it could to get all the new faces in new places and maximise interest in the test. Having that as the soft launch for 2021, with Vettel, Sainz and Ricciardo all driving for their new teams, alongside Alonso and the 2021 rookies, would be a much more effective spectacle, a little bit like MotoGP's traditional end-of-season test. And the third point, which is what's irritated Ferrari the most, is where F1 draws the line at what counts as helping young drivers and what should be rewarded. After all, Ferrari's had 9 protégés on its books in 2020 and ran 3 of them in an F1 car in Italy earlier this year. It's got Charles Leclerc in its Works F1 team, has helped Schumacher into F1 next season with Haas, and found seats in the test for Callum Ilott and Robert Schwartzman. If a team's commitment to young drivers throughout junior motorsport is grounds for an exception, then why didn't Ferrari get one? The bottom line is Renault's rivals feel it shouldn't be for F1 or the FIA to choose selected handouts on which drivers they help, or to undermine unanimous decisions made through the proper rulemaking channels months in advance. Ferrari's late request to run Sainz was a chance to rebalance the situation and open the test up to everybody, and frankly it's odd that the rulemakers didn't choose to do that. Nonetheless, Alonso's back and doing what he does best, driving F1 cars and riling up his rivals. But who do you think's in the right here, and more importantly, who do you think's in the wrong? And would you like to have seen the drivers changing teams in 2021 be given permission to have taken part in this test as well? Let us know in the comments, give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and remember to subscribe to The Race if you haven't already to join us for future F1 videos and get everything you'll need to know to stay up to date with Alonso's comeback.